You would not survive one day in ancient Egypt. Not because of scorpions, not because of mummies' curses, because of noon. Just noon. 43 degrees Celsius, no shade, no ice, no cold drink anywhere on the planet because refrigeration won't exist for another 3,000 years. Now, here's the part that should actually bother you. The average Egyptian laborer did this every single day, not as an emergency, not as an ordeal, as a Tuesday, and then lived to 60, which, in the ancient world, made you basically immortal. So how? No electricity, no fans, no fridge, just mud, linen, and beer. Let's take it apart. Here's the thing nobody tells you about ancient Egypt. We look at it and we see gold. We see Tutankhamun's face on a museum poster, pyramids, mummies. What we never see is the actual engineering problem sitting underneath all of it. How do you keep millions of people alive, working, and not dying of heat stroke in one of the hottest places on Earth for 3,000 years with zero electricity? Because that's the real achievement. Anyone can stack rocks into a triangle if you throw enough time at it. Keeping the workforce alive long enough to finish the triangle? That's the hard part. So today we're taking apart exactly how they did it. The buildings, the clothes, the beer, the salt, the wind, the wigs. And by the end, you're going to feel a little uncomfortable because the Egyptians solved this problem so completely that we've spent the last 100 years solving it worse, just with more electricity. Let's go. Here's what you probably picture. Egyptians enduring the heat, suffering through it, gritting it out through sheer stubbornness, like the desert was an enemy they held off by willpower alone. That's wrong, and it's wrong in a way that's actually more impressive than the myth. Egyptians weren't fighting the desert, they were living in a thin green ribbon next to it, and they'd spent thousands of years quietly engineering that ribbon so completely that the heat stopped being a threat and became a design spec. The shape of the houses, the fabric of the clothes, the exact hour the workday started, what you drank, what direction your bed faced. All of it, tuned, generation after generation, to one single problem. They didn't beat the sun. They made peace with it. Then they read the fine print. And to understand how, we need to talk about the least glamorous topic in Egyptology: sweat. You have exactly one serious cooling system, and it runs on water. You sweat, that sweat evaporates, and evaporation pulls heat off your skin. That's the whole trick. Dogs pant. Elephants flap their ears like radiators. Pigs roll in mud because they barely sweat at all. Humans? 2 to 4 million sweat glands. We are, without exaggeration, the best sweaters on the planet. But the system runs on a consumable. A laborer in that Theban heat can lose several liters of water a day, lose 2% of your body weight in fluid, and your brain measurably slows down. Lose 5%, you're in real danger. Lose 10%, you're dying. And here's the cruel part. You're dying confused, because heat takes your ability to notice something's wrong before it takes anything else. There's a second, sneakier problem. Sweat isn't just water, it's salty. Sweat hard enough and you can drink an entire river and still collapse because you've flushed out the sodium your nervous system needs to fire. That's hyponatremia. It kills you exactly as dead as dehydration does, with the added insult that you'll be holding a full water jar when it happens. So the entire Egyptian survival equation comes down to 3 moves. Cut the heat load, replace the water, replace the salt. Everything else in this video is just increasingly clever variations on those 3 moves. Start with the house, because this is where it gets genuinely brilliant. Egyptian homes were mud brick, Nile silt, chopped straw, packed into molds, baked hard by the very sun it was built to defeat. There's a nice irony buried in that. And mud brick has a property modern buildings have spent decades trying to claw back: enormous thermal mass. Here's what that actually means. A thick mud wall doesn't block heat. It delays it. The sun bakes the outside all day, and that heat crawls through the wall slowly, taking hours to make the trip. So peak afternoon heat finally arrives inside your house around midnight, right when the desert night has gone cold and you actually want it. Then the night's cold crawls in the other direction and shows up at noon, exactly when you're desperate for it. The wall isn't insulation, it's a time machine for temperature. It takes a 20 degrees Celsius daily swing and flips it perfectly out of phase with what you need. Nobody in 1350 BCE was doing thermal lag equations on a chalkboard. They just noticed thick walls made life better, thin walls made it worse, and they built that way for 3,000 straight years. Then they stacked more tricks on top. Small windows, set high because hot air rises and you want an exit near the ceiling, whitewashed walls, bouncing sunlight instead of soaking it up narrow streets in worker towns like Deir el Medina, so buildings shaded each other for most of the day, rooms arranged so the ones you use in the afternoon sit on the shaded side, and the roof. The roof was flat, and the flat roof was a second house. In the hot months, huge numbers of people simply moved their beds up there at night, where the air moved and the heat radiated straight off into a cloudless sky. Sleeping on the roof in an Egyptian summer wasn't poverty, it was the penthouse. Now here's where it gets genuinely clever. Egyptian houses had a feature called a malkaf, a wind catcher. You can see one painted on a rooftop in the tomb of Nebamun at Thebes around 1300 BCE, and it's unmistakable. A hooded scoop angled straight into Egypt's reliable north wind. Wind hits the scoop, gets funneled down a shaft, and pours directly into the room below. Meanwhile, the hot air, being hot, being lighter, is escaping through those high windows on the far wall. You've built a pressure difference, a chimney lying on its side. No moving parts, no power source. It works because wind exists and heat rises, and both of those facts are going to keep being true forever. And then some households pushed it one step further, and this is the part that gets me a little emotional. They placed porous clay jars of water directly in the path of that incoming air. Water seeps through the clay, evaporates off the surface, and evaporation, as we already established, steals heat on its way out. So the air reaching your room has already been cooled by an evaporating surface before it ever touches your skin. That's a swamp cooler. That's the exact same machine you can buy at a hardware store today for $200, plugged into a wall socket. They built it out of a pot and a hole in the roof. This idea never actually died either. It evolved into the towering wind towers of Yazd, Iran, some of which are still standing, still working, right now. The technology was never obsolete. We just got cheap electricity and decided burning things was easier. Your instinct in brutal heat is to wear as little as humanly possible. The Egyptians knew better, and the reason is worth sitting with. Egyptian clothing was almost universally linen, made from flax. And linen happens to check every box this climate demands. The fibers are hollow, so air moves straight through the weave. It wicks sweat aggressively, spreading it across a wide surface so it evaporates fast. And it's a terrible insulator, meaning it doesn't trap the heat you're desperately trying to shed. Cotton holds moisture against your skin. Wool insulates. Linen does neither. In this exact climate, it's about as close to the perfect fabric as ancient technology gets, which is why flax farming became one of the foundational industries of the entire civilization. There's also a brutal quality gradient hiding here that tells you everything about who had power. The finest linen, royal linen, was woven so fine that surviving scraps today are nearly transparent. Elites wore that. Field laborers wore coarse, heavy linen, a simple kilt, or in a lot of cases, barely anything at all. Same sun, same civilization, wildly different experience of it. That gap runs through this whole story, and we'll come back to it. Here's the counterintuitive part. Loose, pale cloth over bare skin can actually keep you cooler than no cloth at all, because it blocks direct solar radiation while still letting sweat evaporate underneath. You trade a little airflow for a lot of shade. It's the same reason desert cultures across North Africa and Arabia all independently landed on flowing robes instead of shorts. Standing naked in desert sun isn't freedom, it's just a faster sunburn. Which brings us to hair. Wealthy Egyptians frequently shaved their heads and wore wigs. Partly fashion, partly nobody enjoys lice. But a wig also sits slightly off the scalp, creating a ventilated air gap. And unlike your actual hair, it comes off whenever you want it to. Shave your head and you've got a surface you can wash, cool, and cover on demand. Egyptians were also obsessively clean. Priests bathed multiple times a day. Ordinary people used scented oils on their skin, which doubled as protection against sun damage in brutally dry air. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting centuries later, noted the Egyptian obsession with washing, with just a hint of bewilderment, which, coming from a Greek, is genuinely funny. Here's the fluid problem. You need several liters of water a day, and the Nile is right there, but the Nile is also full of parasites, silt, animal waste, and depending on the season and how far upstream the last village was, things you actively don't want to picture. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease carried by freshwater snails, has been found in Egyptian mummies. Drinking straight from the river was not a neutral choice, so Egyptians drank beer. Not casually, structurally, civilization scale, all day, every day. And I need to correct the mental image because this wasn't a pint at a bar. Egyptian beer was thick, low alcohol, made from barley or emmer wheat, closer to a gruel than a drink. It was hydration. It was calories. It was food. It carried B vitamins from the yeast. And crucially, brewing involves heating the mash, and fermentation creates an environment that's hostile to a lot of pathogens. Egyptian beer was, functionally, safer than the river it came from. How structural was this, really? It was payroll. The records from Deir el-Medina, one of the best documented workforces in the entire ancient world, because these people wrote everything down on limestone flakes, including their complaints, showed daily rations of bread and beer as standard wages. And when those rations arrived late under Rameses III, around 1155 BCE, the workers did something extraordinary. They put down their tools. This is generally considered the first recorded labor strike in human history. And it was over beer. Which makes total sense once you understand what we just covered. The ration wasn't a perk, it was the cooling system. Cut the beer and you're not being cheap, you're switching off the water supply for men doing brutal outdoor labor in the desert. Here's the part almost nobody thinks about. You've replaced the water, you haven't replaced the salt. And salt is what stops your muscles and your brain from shutting down by mid-afternoon. The Egyptian diet handled this almost by accident. Bread was the staple. Coarse, gritty enough that it visibly wore down teeth, which we can still see in mummies today as heavily abraded molars. Salted dried fish was common and durable. Natron, the same sodium compound famous from mummification, had everyday domestic uses too. Onions, garlic, dates, figs, dates especially, a near-perfect little package of sugar and potassium. Nobody was thinking about electrolytes. Nobody had a periodic table. But a diet of salted bread, salted fish, potassium-rich fruit, washed down with oceans of low-alcohol beer, produces almost exactly the fluid and mineral balance a human doing heavy labor in extreme heat actually needs. And that's the pattern that keeps repeating through this whole story. Not genius, not knowledge, iteration, thousands of years of doing the thing that worked, quietly dropping the thing that didn't, until the accumulated result looks like it was designed by someone holding a physiology textbook. Don't be outside. The Egyptian day was built around the sun instead of against it. Work started before dawn. The brutal middle of the day, the actual dangerous window, was for shade, rest, food, sleep. Work picked back up as the heat dropped in the evening. Deir el-Medina gives us the receipts again. The workers logged their own shifts, their rest days, and during active construction periods, many simply lived in temporary huts up near the Valley of the Kings instead of walking home across open desert twice a day. Even the pyramids themselves may have run on this seasonal logic. A large share of the labor is thought to have been organized around the annual Nile flood. When farmland went underwater, agricultural work paused, and a massive labor force suddenly had nothing else to do. The flood also made hauling stone by boat dramatically easier. The workday, the work year, and the calendar itself all bent around the sun and the river. And when it went wrong anyway, they had medicine. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, is one of the oldest surviving medical texts on Earth. And it's packed with remedies for fever, burns, headache, the entire catalog of heat exposure symptoms. Some of it is straightforward magic. Some of it, honey on wounds, which we now know is genuinely antibacterial, actually works. Empirical medicine and pure superstition, sitting side by side, completely unbothered by the contradiction. That's the ancient world in one sentence. Here's where the whole story flips. We've spent this entire video treating the desert as the problem Egyptians defended against. But ancient Egypt existed because of the desert. The Egyptians called the fertile black floodplain Kemet, the Black Land. They called the desert Deshret, the Red Land. 2 names, 2 worlds, and a border you could stand with 1 foot planted in each. The Red Land was, functionally, a wall. It's the reason Egypt held a stable, recognizable identity for 3,000 years while civilizations over in Mesopotamia were getting conquered and reconquered on what feels like a rotating schedule. Egypt was flanked, east and west, by hundreds of kilometers of lethal, waterless sand. Armies can't march across that. Supply lines can't survive it. The desert was a moat nobody had to dig, build, or guard, And it goes further than defense. The desert's dryness is the only reason we know anything about Egypt at all. Organic material, papyrus, linen, wood, painted plaster, human tissue, rots fast in humidity, and survives almost indefinitely in dry heat. Every scroll in every museum case, every preserved body, every scrap of painted linen exists because the exact climate that made daily life brutal also made decay nearly impossible. Mummification itself came directly out of local geology. Egyptians noticed that bodies buried in hot, dry sand naturally dried out and survived. And the entire elaborate ritual of embalming was, underneath the ceremony, an attempt to artificially reproduce what the desert was already doing for free. The natron used to dry the body was mined straight out of desert lake beds. So the heat didn't just get survived, it got recruited. It guarded the borders, it dried the dead, it preserved the archive. It's the single reason a civilization from 3000 BCE is, today, better documented than most of medieval Europe. Picture the house one more time. Thick mud walls, still holding yesterday's cool. A scoop on the roof, pulling the north wind down into the room. A porous clay jar sitting in that airflow, quietly stripping heat out of the breeze. A family asleep on the roof under a sky with no clouds in it at all. A jar of thick beer waiting for the morning. Not one part of that needs electricity. Not one part of it has an off switch because it never had an on switch either. And we've spent the last 100 years solving the exact same problem worse, bolting a machine into a window, cooling one room at a time, while the machine dumps its waste heat straight back out into the street, making the whole city hotter, which means you need an even bigger machine next summer. Meanwhile, architects have started going back and studying the tomb paintings at Thebes because it turns out a hole in the roof pointed at the wind was a genuinely excellent idea the entire time. You'll get warm today too, and you'll fix it without even thinking about it. Step into shade, grab something cold, sit near a fan, change your shirt, wait for the sun to drop. Small automatic adjustments you won't even register making. Same equipment, same species, same sweat glands, same 2% margin before your brain starts to slip. The Egyptian standing in Thebes at noon in 1350 BCE was solving the exact same equation you solve every summer afternoon, just with better architecture and considerably worse beer. 3,000 years in one of the hottest places humans ever chose to live, and the answer was never toughness. It was mud, linen, shade, salt, and paying very close attention. So, could you have done it? A full summer in ancient Thebes, no fridge, no fan, the roof for a bedroom, a warm jar of beer for breakfast. Tell me in the comments. See you in the next one.